I'll gladly pay you Tuesday is a brilliant Cheers episode. I know I say that about most episodes, but it really is fantastic. It's one of those episodes where every scene is amazing, every second line is hilarious. I do absolutely adore it. This is the sixth episode of the fourth season, directed, of course, by the wonderful James Burrows. And there will be spoilers from now as I go through the narrative, mostly chronologically, and then I have some random thoughts that I've kind of just put at the end of my notes, mostly things that I found to be very laugh out loud funny. So I'll mention those as well. And it starts off really brilliantly, and they're having a stuffing record where they're trying to get as many guys as possible into the men's room, and Norm manages to squeeze himself in. And I just knew as soon as Norm went in, they weren't going to be able to get the door open again. And it was a very silly, fun way to start things off. And then the main narrative kicks in. Diane reveals that she needs to borrow $500. And she asks Sam for the money, who just gives her the money and isn't expecting to get it back. He also doesn't ask her what it's for, so at this point, Sam doesn't know that it's for a book. Now, I completely understand why Diane wanted this money, because it's a signed first edition of Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. And as a writer, but as a reader and somebody who does love first editions of old books, I can understand why she was excited about this. The fact that Sam didn't know what it was for definitely gives us some pretty interesting moments a little later on. Once Diane's got the money, we then cut to the next scene, and this is 2 weeks later. And Carla asks Sam if Diane has been paying this money back, and I found this scene to be so funny because every minute or so, Diane would reveal, unintentionally, something else that she'd spent money on. She'd bought a new cashmere sweater, and she was eating lobster sandwiches, and then this Girl Scout comes in, and Diane buys these Girl Scout cookies. And what happens with those in a moment, but before I forget to mention, during this scene, Cliff was also trying to break the record for walking backwards. It's another bit of silly humour, and we do get quite a bit of that in this episode, and it was just an absolute delight. Sam is not finding things delightful, because after Diane buys these cookies and puts them on the bar, Sam picks up the cookies one by one and starts smashing them. And by this point, he's clearly annoyed that Diane is spending all of this money on what he now knows is a book. And just the performance there was brilliant. Ted Danson was fantastic. Shelley Long's reactions to it, just so funny, so well done. And I completely understand where he's coming from too, because Diane had borrowed this money. She'd promised to pay it back, even though he said he wasn't expecting to get it back. And she's been displaying these various not inexpensive purchases. So his anger was not unjustified. And Diane comes up with a pretty reasonable solution, actually. She gives him the book as collateral, and she can only get it back once she's paid him back the money. And I think that that's a pretty sensible, reasonable approach. Now, Diane thinks that it's going to go into Sam's safe, where it will be safe, but that's not quite what happens. Now, what's actually really interesting here is that Sam does actually take an interest in the book, to the point where he takes the book home to read in his bath. Terrible idea, but obviously Sam doesn't quite see the value in antiquarian books. But that being said, I think it's worth taking a moment to acknowledge the fact that Sam actually willingly wanted to read this book. And that's quite atypical of Sam, and I think that was a really interesting thing. Unfortunately, he comes into Cheers the next day in this brilliant scene. The shock factor of what this looks like is amazing, because he reveals this fluffy, puffed up, fat book, and the appearance of it is so funny. Heartbreaking, but very funny. And he hides it from Diane, and we have this interesting moment where this character, who introduces himself as Bruce Sayers, played by William Lanteau, says that he's very interested in first editions and he wants to purchase it. And they end up going into Sam's office and getting into a bidding war. But before that happens, Sam is saying he's just going to get the book from the safe. Obviously, we, the viewer, know it's under his jacket. But he says he can't remember the combination. And Diane shouts out, in a bar full of people, that the combination to his safe is his birthday. Shouting out the combination to the safe. was a really stupid thing for Diane to do. Let's hope Sam changed the combination later on. But obviously, it's not actually in the safe. And Sam and Diane go into his office with Bruce Sayers and they get into a bidding war. And Sam ends up bidding more than this guy is willing to pay. And then we have this really, really beautiful scene actually between Sam and Diane when they're alone in the office. And Sam convinces Diane that he's fallen in love with the book. And she's just overcome with emotion and they embrace. And I thought, okay, this is unusual for Sam and Diane at this stage. It's really lovely. And then they kiss and it's just a little glimmer of what used to be. And it's a really beautiful episode and I really thoroughly enjoyed it. The only thing that I would have loved to have seen is Diane's reaction when she saw the book. Of course, because Sam has bought the book from her, she doesn't ever need to see it again. But I would have loved to have seen how she reacted. I imagine she would have screamed. And I think it would have been very funny. But that's not what they decided to show. And what we got was still pretty great. So, as I said, there are a few other miscellaneous things that I want to mention. Mostly things that I loved. But one thing that really irritated me is that Sam said, I could care less. At least 4 times. And because Sam's not the most educated, we can get away with it. Because obviously the phrase is, I couldn't care less. But in a previous episode of Cheers, a couple of episodes back, Diane also said, I could care less, which is very unusual for Diane. And I feel like now that I've noticed this, I'm going to notice it more and more as it crops up in Cheers. So that bugged me a little bit, especially as it was 4 times in this episode. But as I said, because it's Sam saying it, we can kind of get away with it. The other things I loved are all very funny. One of them, when I recounted, it doesn't sound that funny, but it genuinely made me laugh out loud. And it's when Sam gave Diane the money or the check, and Sam said something to the effect of, it should be you giving me money in relation to their relationship. And it just made me laugh out loud. And the other 2 things are both Carla quotes. Carla, pretty much everything Carla said in this episode was fantastic. And the first one is when she called Cliff an ass jack. It's the time when he was walking backwards. And the other one is actually for Cliff as well. When referencing the word winner, she said it's pronounced wiener. And obviously me saying it now doesn't sound very funny, but just the delivery of the lines. And Rhea Perlman always has just such perfect comedic timing. Very, very, very funny episode. I laughed pretty much all of the way through it. Yes, I wish Diane had seen the book because I would have loved to have seen her reaction. But other than that, I have to say, from the beginning with the the stuffing competition in the men's room to ending on a really interesting note with Sam and Diane, I'll gladly pay you Tuesday is pretty perfect.